Welcome everyone to this Green Party Women event, which is entitled Resisting the Tory Attack on Nature. So thanks so much, first of all, to the Green Party Women for organising this event and for inviting me to chair. It's such an interesting panel discussion. And as I said previously, I'm in the chair hot seat this evening because our key speaker, one of our key speakers this evening is Tina Rothery, and she's also Green Party Women co-chair. And so rather than having to get her to wear two hats at once, I have been invited to step into chair. So thank you very much. It's an issue which I personally hold very dear and which I'm sure resonates deeply with everybody here tonight. It's really important, I think, for all of us to gather in spaces like this and to share our information and to allow time to reflect before we're going out into the world and taking action as Green Party members or as Greens in various different ways. I've personally had a deep interest in environmentalism from a really young age. And I think looking back now, it was my love of nature that's kind of propelled my activism and propelled, my desire to be more involved in the green movement, as I'm sure it has for all of you. But I think there's a kind of deficit in our culture generally with regards to love of nature. And I think perhaps it's when we forget how important nature is to us emotionally, as well as when we look at the science, that leads to this a space for an attack on nature to happen, and we end up treating nature as something which is expendable, and that seems to be what's been happening for decades in society, of course, and that's why we exist as the Green Party, exactly to address that problem. But this evening we're very much going to be addressing the very specific attacks that have happened more recently with this current Tory administration, and they've led to very, very much marked speaking out from groups that we wouldn't normally have heard of. Moderate groups such as the RSPB and the National Trust, which are now taking the unprecedented move of trying to mobilise their members in resistance. And it's really, really great that these moderate groups are speaking out as well as more radical voices. And it's great that we've now got a much more deeper acknowledgement of the breadth of the problem that we're all facing. But the obvious question then, which comes up, is what can we do? And by that, I mean, what can we do collectively to make a difference? And I'm really happy to say that we have got three fabulous speakers here this evening who are going to speak precisely to that question, to share their wisdom and their experiences. And they're going to also invite us, I'm sure, to support the projects that they're working on. Now, I'm going to give you an order here of our speakers, but it may be that we slightly change the schedule of our speakers as we go forward this evening. One of our speakers is Jenny Jones. Baroness Jenny is a Green Party peer. She specialises on climate change, clean air and civil liberties. And we were going to start the evening proceedings with her, but unfortunately she's not been able to join us yet because she's involved in some very important work in the House of Lords. She's detained in one particular motion at the moment, and then she's got some amendments to another bill that's coming up. She's got to vote on various different things, so she will join us if she's able to. She's keeping us on our toes and we will keep you posted with regards to how that goes as the evening progresses. So we're instead going to hear in a minute from Tina Rothery, who's our environmental activist and founder of Nanas Against Fracking, amongst many, many other wonderful things. But first of all, we're going to hear from Joanna Collins. Now, Joanna is a councillor and member of the Wildlife and Habitat Working Group for the Green Party. And she is a Green councillor as well on the High Peak Borough Council, representing Hope Valley in the Peak District National Park, where she lives. And she's tabled some successful motions on the climate emergency and on divestment from fossil fuels. And this is where the Green Party power really comes into play, doesn't it? It's not just about activism, it's about what we can do when we're actually getting into the nuts and bolts of government. Among her voluntary activities outside the council, she does some vegetation and water table monitoring, which I'm sure has informed her other work. And she's also, of course, been able to observe firsthand the impact on the natural systems and biodiversity that's happening all the time around us. Joanna's loved nature all her life, I believe, as I was speaking about earlier. And as she grew up, she came to realise that what goes hand in hand with a love of nature is making sure that we are across social issues, and that's what spurred her on to be a member of the Green Party. So that's enough from me. I think everybody's had a chance to arrive now. So Joanna, I'd love to, it's an absolute delight to hand over to you and to hear a little bit more about what you'd like to talk to us about this evening. So very welcome, and if everybody else would like to join me in welcoming Joanna, you can give a little round of applause with your emoji if you'd like to. So over to you, Joanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen, which will take a moment. Right. So as Zoe said, I'm from the Wildlife and Habitats Policy Working Group. I'm a member of the group, and I was chosen or volunteered to speak. And I'm going to talk a bit about nature now. So I know that Jenny Jones, if she can come, is going to talk about some of the legislation which affects nature. But as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, nature is just being attacked all the time, and particularly because of the 12 years of Tory rule. I'm going to start with some cross-cutting issues and then give a few examples which show how those issues are sort of developing at the moment. And to start with, I thought, well, why are there attacks on nature? Why is nature given less prominence than climate change, for example? So when COP27 was going on, there was masses of media coverage of it, but there's far less of COP15, and that sort of feeds into everything. And I think one of the reasons is that climate change is very visible. I mean, everyone talks about the weather, they notice the weather, and then now it's pretty wintry. The seasons have been very strange, and there's a great deal of coverage of droughts, wildfires, floods. But nature seems to be neglected, and perhaps partly because it's quite distant from many people's lives. Something to appreciate every now and then, but perhaps not to notice on a daily basis. And also, people perhaps aren't terribly well informed about nature. I'm generalising here, obviously, but they come out perhaps a few times a year to a place like this, which is actually very close to where I do vegetation monitoring. And this was taken one day when I was up doing veg monitoring. And obviously it's absolutely beautiful. But in fact, if you look at the bottom of the picture, I don't know how well you can see it, but this is grass rather than what one might expect to find on kinder scale. So this is just saying that what looks like, well, the natural world perhaps isn't quite as diverse as we'd like it to be. And actually this is exacerbated by an emphasis on landscape. This is a beautiful landscape, and even places like Peak Park, the Lake District National Park, the National Trust really emphasize landscape rather than talking about the complexity of nature, which obviously is more difficult. So, sorry, going back to cross-cutting issues, there's the way legislation works is particularly important at the moment. I mean, hopefully Jenny will be able to talk about the EU retained law bill, but it's very, very high level and says in many places the Secretary of State will decide this and that. And the same is true to a lesser extent for the Environment Bill, for example. So even where there's legislation, it can be changed with very little parliamentary scrutiny. And of course, all this has been exacerbated by 12 years of Tory misrule, which have consistently put the public against the private, put private interests before public goods, species and habitats. The public sectors, as we know, whatever people's interests are, I think they know that the public sector has been absolutely hollowed out. And this means that where there are laws in place, as there are, because the EU directives, some of the parts of the EU directives are still in place, which protect nature, there's lack of monitoring and enforcement of what there is. This means that the public sector hasn't got the ability to monitor what's going on, to measure what's happening and whether laws are being adhered to. And then it certainly hasn't got the power to enforce the laws. So water, for example, the maximum fine for discharge of sewage, illegal discharge of sewage, is £250,000. The pay of the chief executive of Severn Trent Water last year was £4 million. So I think that's a pretty extreme example of how the private sector, the power of the private sector means that public authorities are really pretty hamstrung. There's also the chaos and uncertainty. There are a lot of different agencies. There are at least 3 agencies which are supposed to monitor and enforce regulations covering water, for example. And of course, there's the chaos of the Tory government, people changing all the time, and the uncertainty of what exists, of how it's going to be implemented. So moving on, I won't talk about the EU retained laws bill because hopefully Jenny will be able to do that, but they're the EU directives. And importantly, there's the Environment Act, which is replacing partly replacing some of the EU directives covering nature and land management. Some of the Environment Act is really good. It says it's based on the principle that environmental protection should be integrated into the making of policies, the principle of preventative action to avert environmental damage, the precautionary principle so far as relating to the environment, the principle that environmental damage should, as a priority, be rectified at source. So all this sounds great, but back to the Tories and private over public, their emphasis on the economy. The paragraph which I've just read out does not apply to policy so far as relating to the armed forces and taxation, spending on the allocation of resources. So the Environment Act does nothing to address the fact that public authorities responsible for nature protection don't have the resources to actually do it. The Environment Act is very wide-ranging, and some of it is very vague, some of it is very weak. For example, public authorities are supposed to look at what they can do about biodiversity, but they can decide that there's no action they can take. And if they think there is action, they can review their plans whenever they like. So it's really extremely weak, the biodiversity obligations on general obligations on public authorities. The Environment Act also is taking a very long time to be implemented. So targets were supposed to be set in October and are now being set, but again, are very weak. There's probably, well, not probably, water companies are going to have more power to monitor themselves, and there are going to be no targets for water quality, which, given I'm sure that most people have seen the problems which have come to the fore recently about the water quality in our rivers and lakes. And the Environment Act doesn't seem to be set up to do anything about this. I'm also going to focus a little bit on planning, because obviously any planning, any development on greenfield sites is going to disrupt nature, and it's cumulative. So if you decide to build, on a piece of degraded grassland, perhaps that doesn't really matter very much, but that sets a precedent to go on building and covering up more and more of what potentially could be regenerated for nature. In fact, some of the planning laws, again, don't look so bad. The National Planning Policy Framework has nature-friendly things to say. But in practice, local planning authorities, local councils and national parks, where there are national parks, have very little power against private developers. It's not so bad in national parks, actually, but local planning authorities outside the parks have very little power, basically, because they don't have the money to fight the developers. The Environment Act has in it biodiversity net gain. This is 10% net gain for all developments, theoretically. There's lots about this which conflicts really with the Green Party's approach to nature. I mean, in part, mainly, although it sounds good, 10% biodiversity net gain, that this can happen off-site. So you can build wherever's in the local plan, and then you can make the gain somewhere else. So if, for example, you're building on a reasonably biodiverse piece of grassland, you can take another reasonably biodiverse piece of grassland, which is 10% bigger, say, and say, okay, that's biodiversity net gain. But actually, it isn't net gain because you've destroyed the first habitat. And in fact, I've seen an example in the outskirts of the Peak District for a lorry park where they were going to sort of take off some of the surface because it was actually the place was actually quite biodiverse, and sort of dump it somewhere else, expecting those plants to flourish. Much worse is national infrastructure and also the special economic zones and enterprise zones. Michael Gove said that these are subject to the same rules as other developments, but it just isn't true. I mean, has heard how HS2 has ploughed through ancient forests, for example. Something which is deemed to be national infrastructure tends to go ahead anyway. And if anything, even worse, the special economic zones, enterprise zones and investment zones. The investment zones were an invention of Liz Truss, but they may well go ahead. The current government hasn't said they won't. The other types of zones are already there. So, and they cover enormous areas. The zone on Teesside covers 45 kilometres, including Tees Valley countryside. And part of it is a free port where the river Tees has been dredged to make it deeper so that larger ships can get in, and has released a toxic chemical called pyridine from former industries, which has drifted down the coast of northeast England, and has killed millions of crabs and lobsters. The government says that it may not be the pyridine, the toxic chemical, it may be algae, but they have, after great pressure from environmentalists, promised to look into this. Another big issue is agriculture. Agriculture is the biggest pollutant of waterways, both from livestock farming. Again, in the news, there's been quite a lot about chicken farms and runoff from enormous chicken farms along the Welsh borders and in Wales, polluting the River Wye and other waterways. But there's also the use of fertiliser, which runs off the fields and into the streams and rivers and down into the sea. There's also overgrazing, where farmers stock their livestock more and more intensively so that nothing has a chance to grow properly. Sometimes a farmer told me recently, actually, not even grass. So then they have to supplement the animals' feed with hay and corn and so on, which again is taking up land. And landowners have enormous power. Farmers, for example, can build without planning permission in many cases. They can dig up the soil, which is very bad for biodiversity because of the complex makeup of the soil, the microorganisms which live within the soil and then lead to things like this hay meadow in the picture. The government is introducing the environmental land management schemes, which on the face of it actually look quite good. They're payments for looking after land sustainably for farmers, and also for other land managers, with there were three strands: sustainable farming incentive for individuals, local nature recovery, where, for example, local groups of farmers could look at working towards nature recovery and getting payments for it, and where there are also local nature recovery strategies which local authorities are putting together, and landscape recovery. However, just last week, Theresa Coffey announced that local nature recovery wasn't going to happen. It's just going to be an extension of the local stewardship scheme, on which the National Trust commented the government was watering down its commitment to the natural world. One of the really serious things about the environmental land management schemes is that nobody quite knows how they're going to work. I mean, slowly now they're being implemented and people will know, but they're quite complicated. So they're place-based, or certainly the sustainable farming incentive, which has got the furthest, is place-based. So a landowner or a farmer has to look at their land against certain criteria and judge where they can improve, and then they have to apply for the payments. So this is fine for a large farmer, a large industrial farmer, a large landowner who can perhaps pay for a consultant to come in and help them do this. But for a small local hill farmer, for example, it's going to be very difficult. So again, it looks like, companies, private sector, are being preferred over people who are just trying to make a living. So it's all pretty depressing, actually, but there's hope. One thing is that many people say they love nature, even if, as I said at the beginning, perhaps they don't often experience it directly. We've already heard about the NGOs being angry. I mean, RSPB actually began their statement when Liz Truss introduced the EU Retained Laws Bill. We are angry, and made a long statement explaining why. Then 79 organisations signed a letter to the Prime Minister along the same lines. And of course, there's our wildlife and habitats policy, which directly addresses quite a lot of the things that I've been saying. In terms of organisation, there'll be a Commission for Nature, which will oversee rights of nature. And the policy working group is continuing working. Now we've got our policy passed. And Jonathan Elmer, who's the spokesman for the natural world, spokesperson for the natural world, is developing a rights of nature bill with some environmental lawyers. Then the policy includes payments for looking after land in a way that helps nature recover, and taxes for those who don't look after the land in that way. And also a rebalancing of our relationship with nature, which to me is absolutely central to all this and underlies the reason why nature is attacked. Everyone will have the opportunity to connect with nature, and there'll be education on nature available for everybody, both during formal education and afterwards. So that's a very, very brief outline of some of the problems and some of the ways that they might be addressed.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was fascinating. I mean, what a rich presentation you just gave us there, talking about the fact that we've got sort of weak obligations in law at the moment, and weak enforcement, and just some of the stuff. I mean, I was so shocked to hear about those poor crabs and the lobsters, and this massive stretch of land for 45k, you were saying, for this investment zone. It's really shocking, but fantastic for you to share the granularity of some of this information with us. And I just think that what we'll do, because we haven't yet heard from Jenny, is perhaps, if you're ready, Jo, just to hear some questions to you first, and then we'll move to you, Tina, afterwards, and have questions to you afterwards. Yeah, getting a nod from Tina as well there. So then I'd like to open up the floor. If you'd like to raise your hand, if you've got any questions for Jo.
Yeah, my question is about everything you said resonated with me because I live near Sizewell, and especially about the water, where they're going to take so much water, 2 million litres a day for Sizewell. And the planners actually, after all the 12 years of planning consultation, turned it down and recommended it not to be built. And the Secretary of State just overturned it. So what is there in the current kind of setup that we can do in terms of government? Because everything that is set up, like the Infrastructure Planning Commission that was then sidelined, everything that's set up is ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert by any means, but I know that some things are going to judicial review. So there are processes for, I mean, an example actually is a road building project which near me, which isn't a huge attack on nature, but it certainly won't achieve what it is supposed to achieve, which is relieving congestion. And a few campaign groups locally are trying to get a judicial review of that. So there are things that can be done. Oh, in fact, yes, it says Sizewell is going for a judicial review. I mean, what worries me, is, I must say, without being an expert, as I said, is that it sort of delays things, but doesn't necessarily stop them. So in a way, everything gets even more chaotic because, you know, everyone sort of has to wait for the results of the reviews and doesn't really know the way forward.
It's not a user-friendly system, is it?
It's
not one, as you were saying, you know, previously, it seems to be designed to favor, you know, whole system, as you know, this is not news, but it's good to speak to it again. The whole system is designed to favor those with money or the larger corporations, when it's the smaller farmers that might be able to make a real difference, that have got that real connection with the land. They're not just thinking about, you know, their bottom line financially. Yeah, it is quite disheartening when we really start to look at the detail of these things. Thank you, Joanna. Okay, Joanna, it's been really great to hear from you. I can't see that anybody else has got any questions. I'm not seeing anything else coming up in the chat. I mean, it was really, really great. I mean, what do you feel that you need as a working party? Is there anything that you need from us as Green Party members? How can we help you? How can we support you?
Well, I mean, from what I know, it's a pretty active group, but obviously new members are always welcome and people taking forward our ideas. I mean, one thing I didn't mention is that we produced a leaflet, which is on Green Spaces for local groups, which summarises our policy. It's sort of very simple. And looks nice and so on, just for campaigning.
Yeah, well, that sounds
great.
So
people can use that. There are a few real details about adapting it slightly for local use, but it's there anyway for people to use. So that would be really good.
Well, can I then invite us to get hold of that leaflet? And we have the email addresses of everybody who's come to the meeting this evening. Maybe one of the things we'll do is follow up with an email out to everybody who's attended, or if we're not able to do that, maybe we'll link it in one of our newsletters that we send out. And of course, you know, please keep talking. It's great that we've got this relationship now between Green Party women and with your working group. Let's keep making sure that we keep that dialogue open, and that, you know, we make sure that our members hear about the work that you're doing and find out different ways of, you know, supporting each other. It feels that the more we build these networks inside the party and extending our outside the party as well, we can do that. Now, I've just got somebody who's messaged me, Peter, who said that he's trying to ask a question without success. So Peter, before we move on to Tina, please do. I noticed a thumbs up from you, but I thought you were just agreeing with us. So apologies for that. Would you like to unmute and ask for a question?
Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Right, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I do struggle with IT sometimes. I mean, I'm a relatively new member to the Green Party. I've been involved in environmental protest for many years as a founder member of Extinction Rebellion, and I think that the point I would like to make is this without a control governments like this, what concerns me more than anything else is ultimate accountability. I'm talking about Michael Gove with the Cumbrian coal mine and everything else that they're doing. I'm also a lawyer of 25 years standing. I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last. There's an article in the Law Society Gazette this week where the great and the good members of the Law Society had a round table meeting to decide how they should respond to the climate crisis and what they could do. And as far as I'm concerned, it was utter greenwashing. And they're basically, I think most people see lawyers and corporations and accountants, the big four accountancy firms, as all part and parcel of the same system. And the point that people are making here as well is that it's the system that's got to change. But in terms of accountability, what I would like to raise and kind of put on the table is I'm also involved with the Stop Ecocide campaign. They're at COP26, COP27. There's broadly speaking an agreed definition of what amounts to ecocide now. And what it boils down to is that people who are carrying out what we could call, I suppose, acts of environmental vandalism with knowledge or reckless as to whether they do that damage. And what I think that lawyers should be doing in particular,
Peter, sorry to interrupt you. I just would love you to just jump into the question for Joanna if you had it. All of this is really interesting and it is really fascinating, but I am mindful that we do need to move on to Tina as well. So if you could just direct the question about this to Joanna, that would be fantastic.
Directed in what fashion? How do you mean?
If you could just come to the point of the question that you wanted to ask Joanna.
Well, it's quite a complicated point, but I mean, if we don't have time, I'll bring it up in another forum. It's fine. But I mean, basically, what I'm saying is that the Green Party need to adopt that ecocide definition. Then we need to maintain a register of people that we include in the present government and corporations who are clearly committed ecocide, and then at some stage, those people need to be held accountable, and that's the point I'm making. Is that if you're going to change the system,
it's a brilliant point that you're making there, Joanna. I'd love to then perhaps the question is, are there plans to address the issues of ecocide? I mean, I know that there are other members probably in your group that have already been thinking about these issues very deeply as well, and that are also involved in things like Extinction Rebellion. But did you want to speak briefly to that? Thank you for that, Peter.
We haven't used the word ecocide, but we have got rights of nature, which will be all-encompassing and will be a way to fight against what the government is doing currently and all the other issues, along with other parts of our policy, such as educating people, but that's, in a sense, not perhaps what you're talking about. And as I've said, the group is developing a rights of nature bill, and although obviously, I mean, it's going to take a while to develop it with the environmental lawyers because they're working voluntarily and they have their jobs to do as well. But obviously it wouldn't get passed with this government, but the idea is to get as much support for the bill as possible to draw attention to the fact that there needs to be an overarching approach to nature, to protecting nature. So although we're not using the term ecocide, I think we are sort of addressing the problem head on as a kind of overarch, as a problem that goes through so many different aspects of the way that our country is run.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanna. And yep, I mean, I know there's a Green Party member, John Fuller, who's particularly passionate about this issue as well. So Peter, if you want to email Green Party Women, we can make sure that you're put in touch with others, because you said you're a relatively new member of the party. We can make sure that you're connected up with other people that are really as passionate as you are about this issue. So thank you very much. Well, Joanna, all that leaves me then to say is thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. And Tina, I'd love to now move over to introducing you. Now, For those of you who don't know, Tina is a writer, activist, and a long-standing environmental campaigner focusing on resisting fracking. She co-founded the Nanas Against Fracking group, a group of grandmothers who've been key to the anti-fracking movement. They conducted direct action protests against fracking in Lancashire and further afield. And Tina was also previously involved in Occupy London, and she now works for 0 Hour on a climate and ecology bill, which I'm sure she's going to tell us all about this evening. Now, it's no exaggeration to say that Tina is an absolute force in our movement. And those who know me and have known me for a long time, and I've never actually told Tina this, will know that when my kids were little and I couldn't be quite as active as I am now, I used to say to them, when I grow up, I want to be an anti-fracking nana. Because the movement was hugely inspiring to me, and it was so great to see other people out on the streets when I was stuck at home worrying about my kids' future. So it's a particular pleasure for me now to be able to call you, Tina, a friend, as well as somebody who has been an inspiration to me. And I'd like everybody here, I'd like to invite you all to very warmly welcome Tina here this evening as our key speaker, and very much looking forward to what it is that you have to share with us. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you very much. I probably want to share rage really more than anything else, sadly. I find it quite astounding listening to Joanna and of all of the things in this new role I have with 0 Hour, which is to propel the climate and ecology bill that was brought into the Commons by Caroline Lucas and is now been adopted by over 200 councils and about 170 MPs, I think, as well as the peers. And I hear about laws and rules and regulations, and then on the flip side, we see that the government is introducing a strict law against protesters like me that would make it really difficult to be that last line of defense when the government screws up, which inevitably it will. That we then won't even be able to do that. And yet the government is breaching legally binding agreements on a regular basis. And who holds them to account? In theory, us at a vote in a few years' time, and by then so much will have happened, they'll have made us forget how incredibly awful they are. But the fact that they can do this, and just allow me to read the result of a Freedom of Information request that came out last week. You'll know we all recently had COP27, which is the climate summit, but then we're currently over in Montreal now having the biodiversity equivalent of that, which is COP15. And which always strikes me as odd as well that we put these into silos, whereas I think we all know that nature and climate and environment and biodiversity is one great big living holistic system. And yet the government sees fit to separate into little silos because then you can manipulate the figures in each. Anyway, the Freedom of Information request came out. It says the government is set to miss its flagship 30 by 30 biodiversity target after ignoring recommendations from its own advisors. The 30 by 30 target is a global movement to protect 30% of all land and sea by 2030 for nature. And it was adopted by the UK in September 2020, and it is the key focus of the current COP15 that's happening in Montreal for biodiversity. The government itself actually claimed a key role in driving this campaign, but the new documents obtained through Freedom of Information reveal that there's been a failure of leadership at home. Britain has failed to implement any of the key recommendations on how to meet 30 by 30 made by its own statutory advisor, Natural England. And the review of the National Parks Commission, that came out in the review of national parks that was commissioned by the government. Wildlife groups have accused the government of blindly ignoring its own experts, putting the 30 by 30 target in jeopardy. And this, the 30 by 30 target was supported by every major nature charity and NGO, and yet we're choosing to ignore it. And then things happen like last week where they announced that we're going to have a coal mine and we're going to pretend that's nothing to do with any of this. And we're going to pretend that we're doing well because when we measure things like our emissions and our reaching towards targets for climate as well, that we're not actually going to count aviation or shipping or the fact that we bring in all these goods from abroad. So I think that it's such a hypocrisy, and I find it very difficult to work out where we go from here, because as an activist for the last over a decade, I wanted to try and find a way that would save people like me, and I see Alan Todd in the audience, he and I who have shared, you know, bloody damaged bodies and handcuffs, that we wouldn't have to keep doing that I wouldn't have to rally our nanas to get out and stand in front of a truck. That really, is that any way to have to behave in a democracy when the government has already promised and pledged all of the things that we're actually protesting that they haven't achieved? And actually, I would wonder that the lawyer in the House, Peter Smith, was it? That where do we stand with the law? Where do we stand with the law as to who holds that government to account when they breach these promises? You know, the UN said the other week, didn't he, that, you know, we're going down this road and rather than getting off it, we're actually pressing our foot down on the accelerator. And, you know, we hear our government say, we're a small contributor compared to everybody else. You know, what we've lost in nature and what we're causing with emissions is nothing compared to other countries. What they don't take into account is the harms we do abroad. We offshore our guilt. We offshore to places that are being nature depleted and polluted by, you know, getting our goods from abroad and importing things from there. But that's still our mess. It's still something we should be counting in our targets so that we're not meeting. I'm sorry, I've lost my place now. It's not a good thing. So the climate and ecology bill, I was really blessed. I was in the House of Lords last Friday and didn't manage to overlap with Jenny because she was in the middle of trying to get through the Clean Air Act, which is another brilliant piece of work by the Green Party. Because if you get things through, like the Clean Air Act, then various planning applications, say for something like fracking, would just be illegal because it is going to damage the air. So last week on Friday, Lord Redesdale took the Climate and Ecology Bill's committee stage as an opportunity to draw attention to the nature targets within that bill, and amended it, and it passed through its stage of the Lords now, and its next stage will be to go through to the Commons. And it was supported, and the reason that they separated off the ecology from the climate and ecology bill is because we find it so very difficult to convince conservatives to use the word climate and to support things about that. They will support nature though. So when we were saying to Joanna, what can we do for you? What I think we can do as individuals for the Green Party and just for nature in general is to, I know it sounds so dull, lobbying your MP and writing to your paper, but we need to raise our voices to say that, you know, these things are passing through Parliament, but they will be shot down and thrown out. The only thing that will stop them being shot down and thrown out is if we've upset enough MPs. Now, by separating off nature and ecology, we can be saying to our MPs, particularly the Tories, that this is about nature. And it's about nature, it's about birdsong, it's about the quality of our water, it's about the quality of our wildlife and our soil and the air we breathe. It's all about that. Now, those are the things they can't walk away from as easily. And one of the tactics I'm about to start using is, certainly with our MP, Scott Benton, is that when it comes time for elections, our MPs say things that sound just lovely, just really lovely promises that will never be kept. And these promises you can check on their history and their voting record. And they've said things like, you know, obviously we want to protect this special green space here where we live. So work at it locally. So they want to fix that locally. So by quoting back to him the things he's promised he cares about, and then sharply contrasting the lack of any activity on that, but he could make himself look good by signing up for the climate and ecology bill. I spoke to Gina Dowding earlier this evening. She was our Northwest MEP and is a key councillor in Lancashire County Council, as well as Lancaster City Council. And they're actually just in the middle of going to try and take the climate ecology bill into to get Lancashire County Council to adopt it. And what she needed, though, was for us to find a Lancashire angle. And I think we can do that. And it won't take much work on behalf of the campaign group 0 Hour to do that. So I put that to them. But I would say to everybody in the room, if you can approach your council to support the climate ecology bill, then if you get a council and they want a local angle, just ask me and I will find you the right person with the right research to find that local angle. But I think that that's the only way we can do this, because again, we've tried, and it's like when we spoke earlier about the ecocide law. And the ecocide law is just, when the first time I heard that a few years ago, I was just dumbstruck by the brilliance of it. That, you know, genocide is a crime against humans, you know, wiping out groups of people. Ecocide is eradicating the very stuff of life that we need to live. So how is that not a law? But the problem is, little countries are signing up to this. The big countries have no intention of doing that. And why do they have no intention? Because they are short-sighted. And each politician is working in his silo on his bit and manipulating it. You know, I think that was one of the most telling things, the greatest learning from the activism with fracking, and why I wrote a piece for Bylines this week about the coal mine, even though I'm not anywhere near as expert on coal as I would now consider myself to be on fracking. It really wasn't a problem. It was the same story. The same manipulation of lies, you know, of truths, and the same working their way into the community, making themselves look shiny and welcoming, you know, supporting the In Bloom competition, getting some T-shirts for the local football team, and then telling you that this is going to be good for the local economy and it's going to bring jobs. And, you know, there are 500 jobs with that. There would be 6,000 if we went for green jobs, but they won't go for that, because they're only speaking in the short term. And they think, I find it so insulting that it's as if they think they're talking to idiots, you know, and you look at the state we're in with the cost of living crisis and this new law to stop protest. And we're getting pushed into a corner where we've got nothing left to give. Who has the time? Who has the energy? Who can take time off work to protest? Who can run the risk of a 10-year prison sentence because you upset somebody? It's absurd. And I think I'm watching the unions right now, and I asked the unions about if this protest law comes in. I realize I'm taking off target at the moment, but we will protest this. We will protest to protect nature. And I said to the unions, well, if they're going to outlaw our protests, what happens to your picket lines? And they said, well, it's okay, you're covered if you are picketing where you work. But it would mean they could never have outside support either. It's like, say, for instance, our nurses aren't able to protest in 2 days' time here because their hospital trust won't let them. So instead, the unions have gathered, you know, environmentalists like us and all sorts of other people, and we're going to go and we're going to form a picket line for them because they can't be there. But that would be totally illegal under this. And so anyway, sorry, back to nature. I didn't mean to drift. But I can't think of anything more obvious than the need to protect nature and meet those biodiversity targets. And that whole proclamation of 30 by 30, whereas what's really happening is we're actually making the situation worse. There were 40 MPs who've just recently written to Rishi Sunak, imploring him to join that COP15, which he didn't do. And he had no input into that. And, you know, we could, I put this at the end of the article I wrote for Bylines, which was, I ended it with that scene with Marlon Brando. That I could have been somebody, I could have been a contender, but instead I'm a bum. Yeah, that's who we are. We could lead the way. We really could. We are a small island, and there are a lot of great resources and solutions available to us, but we don't take them. But we could. We could lead the way, and we could look amazing. And any day he wakes up, Rishi Sunak could get up, look around the table of his committee cabinet, and say, right, we're actually going to do the right thing. And let's start. But instead we don't. Instead we make rules and laws to stop the people who do want to do the right thing and leave ourselves stranded in this place. And I don't have an answer, but that's why I joined 0 Hour, because to me, what I need is a law that's mine. You know, my dealings with the justice system have never been very pleasant. And back in 2016, I was due to go to prison. And the reason I was due to go to prison was because I was in contempt of court. I was supposed to pay something to a fracking company for occupying their field. And I just plain refused, because there was nothing wrong with the field and nothing had happened and nobody lost anything. And I was told that I had to pay them £55,000 because they wrote some notices in the Times and there was legal costs or something. And I just thought, I'm not even going to engage with this process, because if you can afford it, you buy the law and you use it to batter protesters. But if you can't afford it, like I couldn't, you're just, you're left stranded. So to me, it was an abuse of the justice system and an absolute abuse of the law. So I refused to engage with it at all. And I knew I would go to prison for refusing to engage, but I didn't really care, because even if the fine had been like a penny, I wouldn't have paid it anyway. I'd have gone to prison for as long as they needed. As it was, the judge could see how he'd been used and how the justice system had been manipulated. And we worked out a nice agreement where I didn't have to go to prison anymore, which was nice. But having seen that and seen how easy it is for it to be used against us, I decided recently that rather than keep asking nanas to go out in the streets, I would try to find a law that would do the job for us, that would prevent, so that when something like a fracking application or a coal mine or the destruction of a nature reserve came across a desk, or dumping sewage in the water came across some planner's desk, he go, oh, you know what? I can't do that. It's illegal. Because what we also found during the anti-fracking protests was that when we approached our councillors and MPs, a lot of them would have liked to have been sympathetic, but couldn't, because a lot of them are bullied. On the day we got, the week we were objecting to planning, and we succeeded in getting planning to reject the frack site here, which Westminster then promptly overturned. But the point was, we did get our councillors to say no to it. Someone from Westminster came up and told those councillors that if there was financial loss to the region, it would be on their shoulders, which was an absolute lie. What an awful thing to say. But this is the sort of bullying that goes on. And councillors, and especially we know our Green councillors, they are working really hard. There's a great deal to take in. And to be manipulated like that is just awful. So I think we need to fight for laws. I put a link in which takes you to a petition that's associated with the Climate and Ecology Bill. As I said, Caroline Lucas introduced it, and it still has a little journey to go. But within the next 6 months, we'll know whether there's any hope for that. Climate targets are all well and good, but we can't implement them at home. So anyway, that's roughly it really from me. And I'm so sorry Jenny hasn't made it yet. I was ready to stop at any time.
Tina, that's fantastic, and thank you so much. And I mean, if Jenny had come, I would have said that, just speaking to what you were just talking about, Jenny of course was labelled as a domestic terrorist by the Met Police, which is actually also pretty sad when you consider that she's the one that's actually been standing up in the House of Lords against those terrorising our natural world, just as you've been standing up and also resisting who are the real terrorists in this scenario.
Yeah.
And perhaps that more than anything symbolises absolutely what we're up against. And you brought some really pertinent points to us. It is as much about enforcement, of course, as well as it is the laws, but having those laws in place is the first step. And yeah, again, I hear what you're saying about we can't believe that there aren't these laws in existence already. And when we're so familiar now, aren't we, with that sort of constitutional phrase of parliamentary sovereignty. We wanted our power back, which is all well and good, but then we need the right people in Parliament and the people that are interested in protecting us. The first rule of government, of course, is to protect its citizens, but that isn't really what's happening at the moment. So we're getting some lovely feedback in the chat here. Incredible information, Tina. Very informative, excellent points. Absolutely want to echo that. And I'd love now to open it up for anybody who'd like to give some questions. We are at the hour, but, let's give ourselves another 5 or 10 minutes to have an opportunity for some questions if anybody would like to ask them.
And for any hope that maybe Jenny might still make it through.
I know.
But, we have to forgive her because, she works so damn hard.
We absolutely do. We might have to let go of that hope this time around, but that maybe she'll come back and do a special for us and another time when, fingers crossed, she's not quite so busy, although that might be dreaming. Alan, please do turn on your camera if you'd like to say hello to us and let us have your question or the question for Tina.
Can I just say before Alan speaks, Alan is amazing. Alan organised every one of those Green Mondays we had for over you know, 1,000 days were at that site. And every Monday, Alan organised speakers that were amazing. George Monbiot, everyone. And he was just such an integral part of the anti-fracking movement. Hi, Alan.
I was watching those.
Hi,
live
Tina.
streams. Thank you, Alan.
I can't actually start the video, but it's probably better without anyway. Not surprised to hear that Tina is carrying on doing brilliant stuff, but one very selfish and specific question, Tina, is I hope that doesn't mean that the Nanas are not going to be able to come up to the Whitehaven mine site once they start trying to do work there, because I was planning to contact you in the new year about that.
You 100% have our full commitment. We've already discussed it. Everyone's got their tabards neatly ironed and their boots ready.
Right, that's brilliant. Could you actually, if you've got time between now and Christmas and the new year, start putting something out on social media with the necessary links, because we want the people up here to know that just like you didn't go away from Preston New Road, the protest that we had on Friday and Saturday will be just the beginning if they seriously think they're going to start work on that site. But the problem that we've got is, unlike Preston New Road, which was very visible because of the road going past, what was it, the A583, this is in a relatively isolated, not very much traveled position outside of Whitehaven on the top of a hill. And it's going to be more difficult to get a sense of solidarity for people. Anyway, that's me.
Thank you, Alan. You've got your booking. Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
I think it was there already, but it's sorted. And please let Green Party women know about these actions.
Yeah, will do. Yeah, well,
So
that was the other thing.
sure.
I will be asking Green
Brilliant.
Party speakers like I did for the Green Mondays.
Fantastic. And I mean, that's how we win this, isn't it? Through collective action. Individually, we don't have the money and the power that other organisations have, but collectively, there are more of us than there are of them. And that's what counts as much as anything else. We've got another question here from Anna Wellings in the chat. Anna asks, can we find a way to ask some MPs about local nature in public? They might be embarrassed into making a promise.
Absolutely.
Have you got anything
brilliant. And that's exactly the thinking. And that's exactly the way to do it. So like with Scott Benton here, he pretended to care about this green space that was going to get developed. But he didn't. I know he didn't, because he did nothing at all to show that. But he pretended to get elected. So I think, but rather than shame them first, I think dangle the carrot. You know, your reputation would be vastly improved locally if you supported local nature preservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that for this, I've noticed some friends here who are involved with a local project in my patch called Steve Baker Watch, which is holding Steve Baker MP to account and doing very similar things. And it's really almost taking the lead as well from things like Led by Donkeys, but doing that much more locally in your patch, you know, making sure these things are known in local papers and really holding their feet to the fire, not literally, but definitely metaphorically. Joanna, you've got a question for Tina?
No, actually, but I was just going to say,
carry on talking.
I think Tina suggested also finding out what they've said. I mean, a local MP has said he's formed a group of MPs who cover the Peak District National Park. The national park is on its knees because it has no resources. So, yeah, they do stuff, but they do stuff for show, which has absolutely no impact whatsoever.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know if you see it too, Joanna, that it's all well and good that they say they're going to do stuff, but it's like there was a period of time where Jacob Rees-Mogg came out and said, you know what, we are putting additional protections on our sites of special scientific interest and national parks. Oh, that's amazing. That's brilliant. They will not be fracked. No, not at all. Okay. Except if Eric Pickles wanted to overturn that decision, then they could be. And I asked him, what is the circumstance under which you could overturn that decision? He said, if the fracking makes more money for the local economy than the national park, then it can go ahead. Now, no offense to national parks, they're really not making that much money for the local economy in the same way that they imagine a frack site would. And also they found a way around it because they could drill outside the park, down and under the park. And that was the Infrastructure Act, wasn't it? Which said that whatever goes on underground is just none of your business, really. They could do anything there.
you know, we could carry on talking about this, couldn't we, for so long, but I do just want to open up one last chance for any further questions from people. I also want to reference, actually, there's now not just a Steve Baker watch, but there's also a MP watch, which is, so these things are happening, popping up all over the country, and our local Green parties are getting very much involved with various different projects to hold MPs to account already, but there's always more that can be done. And it doesn't look like we've got any more questions. So I think I'm going to let everybody go, because we are at 5 minutes past. I'm going to actually hand over now. I'm just going to say one more thank you so much to Joanna and to Tina. And in a way, isn't it a good job that Jenny didn't turn up, because we've managed to have so much to discuss and listen to and talk about with just the two of you here. I'm getting lots of rounds of applause from everybody else. Thank you, everybody else who's attended. Before you shoot off, I'd like to pass over to Mandy, who's going to just remind everybody of all of the other important stuff that Green Party women have got coming up over the next month or so. So Mandy, if I can pass over to you and say thank you one final time to Joanna and Tina. Thank you.